Basil Liddell Hart portrayed himself as a liberal, and his biographers and disciples have perpetuated that myth. In reality, his politics always tended to socialism, although he was promiscuous with any political party that was in power. True, he favoured David Lloyd George, the erstwhile Liberal Prime Minister, yet his liberalism was always fuzzy and tended to break down whenever the policies were detailed or the political administrations changed. He was always suspicious of democracy, which he compared to mob rule. He enthusiastically embraced Italian fascism in its earliest years, and he always agreed with most of the policies of British fascism, although he was repelled by its paramilitarism. And while he was similarly repelled by the Nazi Party's paramilitarist violence in Germany, he portrayed Nazis as victims of Western belligerence. Before the First World War, Liddell Hart was self-admittedly a socialist and an internationalist, as he called it. During the First World War, he repudiated these things and he embraced explicitly nationalism, traditionalism, and militarism. But by 1922, he was disappointed in his influence on the army and he shifted back to socialism and internationalism. From there, he discovered fascism. Liddell Hart was at that point acutely Anglophobic, which helps to explain his preference for foreign fascism. At the time, he recorded no explanation for his admiration for the Italian National Fascist Party, except that by then it was already the most successful of the socialist parties west of the Soviet Union. The National Fascist Party administered Italy's government from 1922. British copycats perhaps encouraged his curiosity that year. From there, the British fascists formed in 1923 in explicit opposition to the Soviets and also the Communist Party of Great Britain. The Imperial Fascist League split off in 1928, and that was more pro-Italian. In the same year, Liddell Hart visited Italy at the Italian government's expense. The government arranged demonstrations by its army and air force, visits to its war college, and interviews with the Prime Minister, Benito Mussolini, the War Secretary, Ugo Cavallero, the Air Secretary, Italo Balbo, and principals of the fascist militia. On his return, he wrote a series of 3 reports for his full-time employer, the Daily Telegraph. These reports admire both Mussolini the person and his politics. Quote, "That he enjoys possession of this power he does not conceal. But to a student of human nature, he gave the impression that he enjoys it basically for the power it gives him to improve and advance his country and his ideas for that country. The freely offered and even joyous subordination of the self for the good of the cause, combined with a discipline of the reflexes, a rigorous repression, not merely of contrary opponents, but of contrary instincts in themselves. Fascism knows that the source of the greatness of ancient Rome lay in her discipline, and with this, perhaps from this moral root, has grown another utilitarian virtue, honesty. Whatever the future may bring, it is at least certain that it will be different from the present. For fascism, responsive to the law of life, is all the time changing its system and adapting its ideals progressively to fresh conditions." Note that here Liddell Hart explicitly associates fascism with honesty, discipline, collectivism, and progressivism. His admiration for Mussolini the man is less clear, although his memoirs contain 3 explanations. First, on their first meeting, Mussolini rose to greet him, disproving what Liddell Hart had heard about Mussolini sitting silently behind a remote desk while visitors approached. Second, Mussolini displayed a photograph of Sir Austen Chamberlain, who was Foreign Secretary in Britain from 1924 to 1929. Mussolini described Austen Chamberlain as an English gentleman. The third explanation in the memoirs is that Mussolini claimed to read Britain's greatest left-wing newspaper, the Manchester Guardian. Liddell Hart's admiration for Mussolini persisted for the rest of his life. Writing at the end of 1931, Liddell Hart looked to Italy as the primary foreign inspiration for what he called his British way in warfare. That's because Italy prioritized bombers and tankettes, as Liddell Hart had prescribed for Britain since 1925. And on mechanization, Liddell Hart said, "Italian authorities take a view free from conservatism." Italy's political appeal is subtle. Liddell Hart presents autocraticness as aristocraticness. He presents Italy's elitism as meritocracy, and Italy's socialism as preparedness. Among Italy's present leaders are acute minds who, in reviving the Roman tradition, have remembered the fact that Roman statesmen understood war as well as politics. Liddell Hart admired Mussolini for picking his ministers by expert qualifications. Liddell Hart claimed that Italian officials offer more common sense and transparency than those of any other nationality. To the courtesy, cordiality, and unrestrained facilities offered me, I cannot pay high enough tribute. He credits fascism for the increasingly active, healthy, and egalitarian Italians that he saw. Italy, like France, has shown a full understanding of the fact that a modern war calls on the whole resources of the nation, which should be organized beforehand. He credits fascism for a new spirit and a real pride of service. And Liddell Hart assesses the Italian army's progress as more moral and physical than mental or material. Back in Britain, in 1931, Oswald Mosley, other members of the Labour Party, and a few Conservatives formed what they called the New Party. In 1932, most of them split off to form the British Union of Fascists, with Italian aid. In January 1934, Liddell Hart accepted Mosley's invitation to join a discussion group called the January Club. And around May of 1934, he accepted JFC Fuller's invitation to visit the BUF headquarters. There, Liddell Hart was gradually repelled by the BUF's militarist policies and paramilitarist symbols, which were coincident with news from Germany of rearmament and Nazi paramilitary violence. Nevertheless, Liddell Hart continued to admire fascist policies, and he continued to praise the current dictators, both Mussolini and Hitler, as progressives and meritocrats. As he wrote to himself in November 1934, quote, "A successful dictator is apt to be more of a realist than is the relatively cloistered member of a general staff. Also, he is usually younger. A significant symptom is the marked increase of attention which has been given to military aviation and army mechanization in Italy since Mussolini and in Germany since Hitler came to power. Here certainly is a warning of danger for democratic countries where military doctrines have been dictated by the heads of a professional class, autocratic within their own sphere and cut off from others." Liddell Hart was always harder on British fascists than foreign fascists. For the rest of his life, he kept a signed photograph of Mussolini on a side table. And even though Mussolini was his favorite, Liddell Hart was also an apologist for Nazism. During the remaining years of peace and throughout the Second World War and after the Second World War, Liddell Hart repeatedly defended Hitler's rationality and negotiability. His post-war histories hardly mention German war crimes and repeatedly claim that Hitler was provoked into war. Liddell Hart's chosen biographers explain his attitude as just professional sympathy and moral equivalency, not political sympathy. But there was political sympathy. Those biographers just chose to ignore the evidence I have just presented to you.